I have a question for you.
Shoot.
Is there enough oxygen for cars to rust on Mars?
That is actually a very good question, and it depends on the sci-fi setting we're talking about, because technically there is probably not enough oxygen for cars to rust on Mars in real life. If you were to put like an old like hoopty on the surface of Mars right now, probably wouldn't rust, because Mars has, it's not just that Mars doesn't have very much oxygen in its atmosphere, it's that Mars has a very thin atmosphere to begin with. So it's not just percentage, it's like amount. So it's, yeah, it may be, because oxygen in Earth's atmosphere makes up like 20% of the atmosphere, but we have a thick atmosphere. We have 1 bar of atmosphere, on average. Mars, I'd have to look up the exact number, but Mars may have, even if it only has like 5% oxygen, it's not necessarily that there's less percentage, it's that there's like, it's a fractional atmosphere. That's part of why you can't just walk around there. It's not necessarily that it's cold, it's that your blood would boil because there's not enough atmosphere to keep your blood liquid,
Well, that's terrifying.
Yeah, like if that's one of the ways you would die on Mars. If you've ever seen Total Recall, it's not like that where your eyes pop out of your head, but it would be probably more horrifying in some ways, because your blood would basically boil in your veins because there's just not enough atmospheric pressure to keep it from trying to turn into a gas.
Well, that's horrifying. So in Spacers, the Erebus Effect, do you think there is enough oxygen for cars to rust on Mars?
It probably depends on where you are on Mars, because the way I envision as far as like lore of like terraformed or inhabited Mars in the Spacers Saga universe, there's different regions of Mars. There's regions where there's like human habitat that are meant for human habitation, and then there's regions that are just sort of left as desert. If you're out in the middle of the desert, it would be closer to what it is now. It'd be closer to baseline Mars, which is, low atmospheric pressure, low percentage of oxygen. But then say you're in like the Valles Marineris, or hell, the Argyre Planitia, which are some of the, or one of these inhabited craters that they would put they put a laminar shield over this crater to hold in the atmosphere. It would have higher atmospheric pressure, and you could in theory walk around outside. Now, there's certain caveats to this that are touched on, I think, a couple times in the story, or at least in some of these stories, about how everyone carries emergency breathing apparatus when they're on the surface of Mars. Like, unless you're indoors, and even really then, like, one of the things you have as a native Martian, or even a visiting Martian, I suppose, is you carry an emergency breathing apparatus with you at all times. It's kind of like, did you ever see Avatar, like the 2009 Avatar?
Yes.
And you know how when they first show up on Pandora, like the crew chief on the big shuttle that drops off all the Sec Force soldiers or whatever, says, the atmosphere is not breathable by humans. You will pass out in 30 seconds. You will be dead in 5 minutes, or some shit like that. I can't remember exactly the quote, but that's the gist of it. It's kind of like that. You have enough time if, say, the atmosphere pressure, like if say a room is breached or something, to put your mask on and then have emergency oxygen from that until you can seek shelter. But it's kind of a stopgap, because it's basically humans adapting to environment, which is part of the commentary. Because there's lots of people nowadays who say, why should we ever inhabit Mars? Because Mars will never be as nice as Earth, even if we terraform it for 1,000 years. But humans, as a rule, at least in my interpretation of humanity, my interpretation of what humans are capable of, we kind of have a way of saying fuck that to things, to expectations of impossibility.
It's the sense of exploration, of expansion, of growth. Like the possibilities of the cosmos. Like, there is something good to be said about that, where you're like, people say, we probably can't do this. Like, well, fuck yourself. I could do that. I could definitely do that. Like,
in Spacers, the Erebus Effect, there's probably only about 35 to 40 million people on Mars tops, which sounds like a lot, but that's a low ball estimate for some of these, for some sci-fi universes, like in The Expanse, which we have talked about at least to some extent. In the Expanse novels and TV show, there's meant to be like 8 or 9 billion people on Mars, and that's only about the same time distance, and that's only about the same distance in the future as the Erebus Effect. Like, I think the first several Expanse books take place in the 2350s. Spacers, the Erebus Effect, is set primarily in 2354. So it's basically the same time span, except one is saying, oh, we're going to have 9 billion people living on a mostly unterraformed Mars, whereas I'm saying no, maybe 40 million tops is more believable, because again, we can have them live in like enclosed crater cities or in valleys and canyons and things like that. We can put, again, the term lamina is something that I stole from a novel. Basically, it's a guy, I want to say Peter F. Hamilton, it was Richard K. Morgan. It's a guy who wrote Woken Furies, and he might have also written, he's written several like cyberpunk type novels and stuff, but he wrote a book called Thin Air, which I really liked, which is about basically a sort of a mercenary living on Mars who gets involved with this conspiracy, it's funny. I first picked up this novel and looked at it back in like 2018, which is after I wrote the first draft of Shadowplay, which then became Spacers, the Erebus Effect. But I didn't actually read it until like last year. Because it came out while I was working at Barnes & Noble, which is in the fall and winter of 2018, but I didn't actually get around to downloading it on Audible and listening to it until last year. It's a very good book. I enjoyed it. This isn't a plug, obviously. We're not
plug other people's books.
We're not being paid by Mr. Morgan or his publishers or publicity people or anything. But I'm just saying, hey, I enjoyed this book. If you like sci-fi, if you like detective thrillers set on Mars, this is a good book.
Definitely. I mean, it's not as good as Spacers, the Erebus Effect, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of, some of it lives in Spacers and the Erebus Effect, because even just what I'm talking about, like the reason I say I stole this term lamina is in Thin Air, the Valles Marineris, which is like this huge canyon on Mars. It's like as wide as the United States and as deep as like maybe 5 or 10 miles in some places.
Sure.
Huge canyon. You can see pictures of it on Google. You can look at pictures where it's like they've laid out the outline of the continental United States over the Valles Marineris, and it literally is like the western edge of the canyon, which from the west end of the canyon to the east end of the canyon would basically go from LA to DC.
Yeah,
it's a huge place. But in this novel, the author speculates that we can put some sort of like film, basically stretch some sort of film over the upper part of this canyon, over across the surface of this canyon, at ground level, basically, like the outside ground level. And you could then pressurize to a certain extent what's inside this, what's beneath this film. So you could sort of have a huge, maybe not huge, but you could have cities built on the ground floor of the canyon, and over top of them you would have this laminar film, because that's basically what lamina means, like skin or film or something like that. It's a Latin word. That's basically what I cribbed from this novel. It's this idea that you could close canyons and craters, especially, and things like that, and then put humans living in cities in there. Because one thing that you did a lot of, that's actually not that, that's something that a lot of writers have done, is you close craters, you close canyons, and you can put people there. Another thing that people have done, especially things like The Expanse, is you have people live underground. This is something that I actually haven't touched on a whole lot in the Spacers Saga, but there's meant to be people living underground on Mars and on Titan and other places, because like a lot of the cities on Mars in the Spacers Saga universe aren't just surface level cities. It's not like on Earth where, you go to Indianapolis, 99% of Indianapolis is above the street level. Most of the city that's below the street level is just like maintenance hatches and stuff, or maybe sewers. On Mars, it would be closer to maybe 60-40. maybe even closer to 50, maybe even closer to 50-50, because there's like tunnels and catacombs that stretch down below the surface where people actually live. Especially because one thing Mars doesn't have naturally that you may not know of, even Derwin, and our readers probably, or listeners probably don't know of, it doesn't have a magnetic field. And when you don't have a magnetic field, you're not shielded from cosmic rays, and cosmic rays can cause cancer. These are basically little bursts of like ionized energy shooting in from outer space, like from the sun and from other stars, that will hit your cells and like damage your DNA and cause cancer and other mutations.
Cancer's bad.
Yeah, so you basically don't want space cancer.
Do not with space cancer, no.
So this is actually something that's talked about a lot by like real NASA folks. Like when it comes to like planning potential human missions to Mars in the next couple of decades, is it's about both the moon and Mars, because the moon obviously doesn't have a magnetic field because it's basically this big dead rock. But people, they talk about, well, if we want to put a base on the moon or a base on Mars or both or whatever, we would probably want to put it somewhere underground. Like there might be lava tubes on the moon, there might be lava tubes on Mars, where you can then basically set up your prefab base underneath some layer of rock and regolith, which is basically soil but not soil, and have it there, because that way you've got some protection over top of you to shield you from these cosmic rays. There's that book that I gave you that I think is sitting right across the room from you right now, Gunpowder Moon. That's where their base is. That's where Seer Serenity 1 is, this base in that book. It's buried in the side of like a crater rim on the moon, and they're buried under like a meter or two of lunar regolith, which is again like basically lunar soil, like a powdery lunar soil. You may remember from the moon landing coverage, and that's basically what it is. You bury this stuff so that you have a little bit of shielding overhead.
Let me ask you this, sir. So this will come out, I don't know, a month later, but we just this morning released the first chapter and the prologue to Spacers, the Erebus Effect, on Literature for Warriors at dividedbyzerobooks.com. And it'll be up there by itself in the preview till January of 2024, when the book starts getting released behind a paywall for $4.99 on Literature for Warriors at dividedbyzerobooks.com and patreon.com/Blanket Fortress of Solitude. What are your thoughts there? Are you excited? Go.
Oh, I'm fucking thrilled. I mean, I almost didn't expect you to have it ready that quick. I was thinking, oh, well, we'll have it ready by the end of the week. But then the first thing I saw when I woke up this morning is like, oh, it's up. Sweet. So,
I mean, all I do was just copy paste, and then I did some indenting and formatting a little bit.
Yep.
And now we're kind of just shopping it around, and it's kind of a preview. It's kind of a beta test. It's kind of hey, what do you guys think? And I'm handing it off to anybody that'll listen, that'll read it. And not only read it, but also leave a comment on it and say, hey, if you have a thought, put it in the comment section. So that's how we get better.
Yeah.
Also, it's engagement for the blog post.
Yeah.
So, and so I'm really proud of this. I'm excited about it. One of my oldest characters, Tommy Sampson, makes an appearance in the prologue, where he's the battalion aid station non-commissioned officer in charge. He's Staff Sergeant Tommy Sampson in this world, and the main character, Janet Harkoff, is going off to get herself killed, and he stops her because she's mad because a guy that she was good friends with and a mentor of hers died, and so she's gonna get revenge, and he's like, hey, don't do that. And because something I liked about the end of the prologue is them asking the question, what if, and then people say, oh, you've got, it's kind of like if someone told Harry Potter, we expect great things from you, young wizard, and you're going to be a good person one day. And what if Harry says, like, what if they're wrong? And then they are. Yeah,
I mean, it's the classic subversion of the trope of the chosen one, which is not just, what if I don't want this responsibility? What if I what if I'm really not worthy of it? Because the classic assumption of the quote unquote chosen one trope, or maybe not even chosen one, it's just that, we expect great things from you, Mr. Potter, like you said, is
the protagonist.
That the protagonist actually wants this, and they think that they want it for themselves. The thing about Janet in this story is, and I think this is a brilliant idea on your part to have this as the conclusion of the prologue, is what if she doesn't really necessarily feel this about herself? And we've got to remember, from our perspective, for those of us who actually know the story and know what's going to happen, because we've written it and have been editing it for months now.
So I might say years, but yeah.
Well, I say months because we've been working on this version since probably the start of this year.
That's true. I
mean, yes, I showed it to you first several years back, and yes, I started writing it almost 6 years ago. But I don't get hung up on that stuff.
Fair enough.
We've been working on it hardcore since probably like February, when I think you asked when you started doing it, is when the first edits for this current iteration started coming about. But anyway, the thing about it is, when Janet says, what if Pepper was wrong about me having good potential, that's before she was married. That's before she had her hardships with Darius. That's before she then did 8 years as basically a killer in the artificial life form control agency. So this is her sort of baseline as like a green, young, spacer first class or senior spacer, whatever I had her as. And she's basically, she's basically saying, well, I don't know what if I don't want to be a leader? What if I don't want to be some kind of great person? What if I just want to be a killer?
What if I'm not a good person?
Yeah, exactly. That's an even better way to say it.
And because the mentors in her life are saying you're a good person and you do good things for people, and then her saying, well, what if I'm not a good person? And the whole book is just her asking and answering that question through different actions and reactions.
Which is, I gotta tell you, I don't know if we've talked about this yet, so this may be some nice content. This hopefully will be some nice content for our little podcast here. It kind of hits home for me, because a question I ask myself all the time is, are you really a good person, Nick? Because my friends, I know you say this, my creative writing friends say this, my buddies from high school and college that I hang out with on Discord every week would probably say I'm a good guy, but I'm not always sure I'm a good person, because I spend time with myself more than anybody else, and sometimes I'm not all that thrilled with what I see. And it's that kind of classic, it's kind of half imposter syndrome, but it's also half self-doubt and anxiety and depression, thinking, what if I'm just putting on a facade of being what if I'm just putting on a show of being a good person so that people will leave me alone and not bother me with how bad I am? What if it's, stuff like that? And that sort of subject matter is very apropos of this arc that we're giving Janet, is, what if she, and obviously it's then going to play out in the next 2 novels of the Shadowplay trilogy, hopefully, God willing, is that, what if she doesn't want to be a good person, even though she does act like a good person at times and does the right thing when given the opportunity. It's that kind of dichotomy, she will do the right thing when given the opportunity, but she still doesn't feel like a good person because she thinks, oh, well, I'm only doing this because that's what's expected of me.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you worry that, is there a part of you that assumes people are deemed good, and by good is often a synonym for accepted by society, mm-hmm. right? And so you have told me how, as an autistic person, you perform normal, I guess, right? And you spend a lot of time observing people, observing behaviors, emotions, kind of like if you, as a guy from Midwest Indiana, got dropped in Beijing, right? And you're in a whole different culture, a whole different language, a whole different universe. And you're just picking things up as you go. And you probably feel like a stranger in a strange land in your daily life. And And so maybe you needing to perform like that to feel like you're accepted. Like there's a part of us that if you look at good as a sense of like shared morality, then, and if that shared morality gets you accepted by the tribe, then that's probably why there's some doubt there, because, you know, if I have to perform for them to accept me, well, then they've never really seen me as I truly am. And whenever I kind of show who I truly am, I feel like they're rejected. Right.
Yeah. Yep.
Am I anywhere?
No, like, you're hitting on some good stuff there. And part of it too is also that when I sort of mentioned this a minute ago, like when I'm in my own head, sometimes I'm very much of a misanthrope. I'm like an antisocial person. Like, you know, I sort of told you this yesterday when we were talking last night about our plans to record today, about how yesterday, which is obviously not yesterday when this comes out, but, you know, July 2nd of 2023, I went to the National Aquarium in Baltimore with some of my family members. Really nice experience. It's a beautiful aquarium. It's really, really nice thing. But this is a big but. It was the Sunday before a national holiday at the National Aquarium. So it was very crowded. People from all over, screaming children. I thought, the more I think about it, the more I realize that, the reason I don't like little kids, especially, they're just sort of so naturally carefree and happy and loud, is that I wasn't that way when I was a kid because I was already depressed.
Well, you didn't get to have that. Like you were different.
Well, it's like, there's a post I read just yesterday where it's talking about how, it really sucks when you have depression because you forget what your personality was like before you were depressed. You forget who you were. And then someone else tacked onto that and said it's even worse when you have depression from young childhood because you never even got to form a personality. You've never even met yourself. I was depressed as like a 6-year-old. So I've never really even met the real Nick Oakes. I don't know who he is. I don't know where he is. So
I feel like I've met the real Nick Oakes several times. And I like him a lot.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, but I've probably mentioned this. I don't really like myself. They say probably part of the reason why I've been so unlucky in romantic stuff is they say you can't love someone else until you love yourself. I don't love myself. I've never really loved myself.
Well, people will see the value. If you don't place value in something, no one else is going to place value in it. Like if you place value in your books. So then I place value in your books. If you said, "Oh, I wrote this, but it's dog shit," I would have no interest in it because I'm like, well, if he doesn't think, I wrote like 9 novellas, and I created an entire publishing brand around them, right? And sold thousands of copies because I believed the fuck out of it. There's no reason it should have worked, and it did. Right now, granted, we didn't change the world. I've got a real job still. But belief in yourself, loving the thing that you believe in, and I don't know, man. Like your stock's on the rise, though, dude. Like you just started like 6 months ago, right? Like you kind of had like your online internships and shit, but the rocket ship for you is just building. I really think in like 5 years, you're going to have like a whole different world, right? And like, you'll be accepted by more people, people are attracted to success. They like winners. You're a winner because you're currently winning. Because look at what you're doing. You're doing shit that winners do. Like if you were still like a miserable guy making minimum wage in Meyer and hating everybody, I'm not sure we would be like as close as we are currently. That's not because, I'm trying to like sponge off your success. I'm currently the most successful guy I know. And so I'm in a spot where I I only associate with people because I see them as good people, as interesting, as they bring value to my life in a non-monetary way.
Yeah.
But you rock bottom's the wrong word, but you being at your starting point and realizing, hey, this isn't good enough for my life. I want more. 5 years ago, you said, I want to work for NASA. And I'm like, you're out of your fucking mind. And then you did. And so people are attracted to behavior like that. I know I was. And so if you were still a miserable guy who couldn't take feedback for his books and like hated everybody and worked at Myers still, we probably wouldn't be super close. But you've grown tremendously and you're successful and you're not done. You know, some people, they sit on their laurels and they're done, right? And you're like me, you'll never be done.
That's one thing I can say about myself, is that I mean, if anything, that's one thing that comes from the depression and anxiety, is when I get somewhere, I'm not comfortable there. I have to go to the next plateau and see what's there. And then I have to go to the next plateau and see what's there. Because I can never just rest. This is kind of a blessing and a curse, because it means that, you know, I'm never really satisfied and I'm never really happy. But on the flip side, it means that I'm always seeking the next horizon. And that's kind of what keeps me going in terms of, you know, wanting to work at NASA. It's kind of what keeps me going, wanting to publish books and maybe make movies of them someday. Maybe, you know, do all these cool things, because when I get to a place that, as you say, some people would just rest on their laurels and sort of build a nest and just sort of set up shop, I'm like, no, you know, and the grass is always greener for me on the other side.
There is something to be said for this, and actually this is the part, but there is something to be said for, you should always be growing, but sometimes, like for me, like I probably spent 2 years just kind of not advancing outwardly, right? Like the publishing stuff didn't go anywhere. The podcast was just kind of all experimental. I did the same thing at my job. I didn't apply for promotions. I was just there. And but I was also going through therapy at the time. And that therapy, I had hit a spot where I had advanced monetarily to a point where I was very comfortable. And then I'm like, oh, well, you got some internal shit to fix. So you should like maybe take a couple years and then fix your internal shit. And now the internal shit's mostly fixed. And as fixed that sort of thing ever gets. And now we're about to launch this book.
Oh yeah.
And you know, we're doing great things.
Hello, stranger. Do you like to read?
Read? What's happening? Am I dead?
I bet you like zombie books.
I like food. Do you have food?
You don't need food at dividedbyzerobooks.com. It's full of nutrient-rich science fiction.
Ugh, I'm stuck in an ad, aren't I?
Once I stop talking, reality will collapse until someone plays this ad again. This isn't the first time we've had this discussion, and it won't be the last. Hello, stranger. Do you like to read?
In March of 1989, there was an asteroid that came within about 2 lunar orbits of the Earth, but in the Spacers Saga timeline, this asteroid destroys Phoenix, Arizona, kills like 1.5 million people, basically levels the entire city. Because this incident, which is called the Phoenix Event, kicks off a wave of spending on space exploration and space defense infrastructure and things like that. Case in point, in this timeline, the U.S. Space Force is formed, just like in our timeline, except it's formed 20 years earlier. It's formed in 1999 instead of 2019. When they were investigating the Phoenix event, they determined that, oh, this asteroid should have missed us. So someone redirected it. which means that either there's aliens out there that wanted to smack the planet, or there's some foreign power that decided they're going to risk dropping an asteroid on the United States. Project Artemis, which is the plan to put people back on the moon and establish a permanent presence on the moon, starts off in like the early 2000s. Instead of the late 2010, it starts off in 2002, 13 years after the Phoenix event. NASA says, hey, we're gonna be serious about this sort of stuff, because there's more congressional support, there's more public support. People are still sort of shell shocked after the Phoenix event. They're basically saying, hey, we want to get out there into the universe while we can. So there's permanent bases on the moon by 2018, and then the Shanghai Pact starts rushing some of its own by the next year. So in 2024, the Special Intelligence Directorate initiates what it calls Project Petrichor. And Petrichor is basically a secret project. It's basically trying to militarize space exploration. And, you might ask yourself, well, why is this secret? We're technically kind of already doing this. The point is, in this timeline, they're doing it like plus ultra, they're launching spacecraft that are supposedly going to be, supply craft for the moon. But then when they get them to the moon, they're arming them. They're basically preparing for a war in cislunar space, with cislunar space basically being the term for space between the Earth and the moon, and then involving both of their hill spheres, which is basically a fancier way of saying cislunar space is the sort of colloquial way of saying space that involves Earth and the moon. So Project Petrichor is basically the Special Intelligence Directorate's mandate to prepare for conflict in the cislunar space. And they basically set themselves a goal of, over the next 20 to 25 years, building at least something like a dozen space supremacy ships. It's like a conflict between the Western powers and China over control of the moon in the late 2040s. There's this guy named Charles Larson, and you could basically describe Charles Larson as kind of like a cross between Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. And he has all of their ambition, all of their bravado, all of their charisma, whatever you want to say, and also he has all their faults and all their good points too. He's kind of like the quintessential billionaire industrialist, kind of the dark side of Tony Stark. He inherited his father's business, his father's aerospace contracting business, aerospace and defense contracting business, when his father died in the early 2020s, or in the mid 2020s, something like that. And then in 2029, in order to revitalize the company's stocks after some tough years, he said, "Oh, well, I'm going to make fusion available to the public." And kicked off the fusion revolution. The fusion market became a thing, which then boosted people's desire to invest in helium, like helium and hydrogen, other things like that from other planets and the moon. Because one of the things you can do when you are when on the moon is mine for helium, which you can then use to fuel fusion reactors. It's a special kind of helium that gets deposited on the moon by the solar wind that you can't really find on Earth, because helium in itself is kind of rare, and this form is exceedingly rare. But on the moon, it exists in the soil, or regolith rather, in some percentage parts per million, something like that. And you can basically harvest it and then ship it back to Earth and use it in fusion reactors, which could provide us unlimited clean energy. In 2038, they established the first permanent base on Mars, the result of efforts by the Pathfinder Corporate initiative, which Charles Larson established after his revelation of fusion power, basically to say, hey, I gave the world fusion, now let's use it to go out there and explore and settle the rest of the solar system, and then eventually the cosmos over the next couple hundred years. But they established a base on Mars in 2038, which was the first permanent settlement there. There had been some landings on Mars as far back as maybe the late 2020s or mid 2020s, something like that. This is the first permanent base. Then in 2051, the UN after much debate following the Lunar War about what went wrong, how to prevent it. And what they came up with was the Tyndall Accords, which among other things, established the Interplanetary Cooperative Administration, or ICA. The way I envision the ICA in the world of the Spacers Saga is that it's never quite a government, the way that like the government of a state or nation state is, but it's sort of like a parent body for governments, sort of like how the UN is a parent body for government. The ICA is sort of an umbrella under which nations and settlements, whatever, nations of all sorts of types can spring up across the solar system and later on in other solar systems, and have a place where they can go to redress grievances, to seek. So for the first almost 8 years of the ICA's function, it was sort of toothless. It was sort of like how the League of Nations before the United Nations didn't really have any power, and to a certain extent the United Nations doesn't have power nowadays. But then in 2058, sort of the burgeoning colonial powers on Mars, which sensed that Mars is going to be the next big thing, Mars is going to be the next frontier, it's basically to preempt a scramble for Mars in the way there was like a scramble for Africa or a scramble for Antarctica, that sort of thing. They passed what's called the Brookenden Accords in 2059. The Brookenden Accords made it possible for nations from the Earth and their affiliates to send people out to settle other planets under certain restrictions. It's basically a redo of the Outer Space Treaty from 1967, which the Outer Space Treaty is kind of the text for how nations deal with the business of outer space. It basically says that no one nation or group of nations can own a part of or all or part of any body in space. They can't take resources from any body in space, which basically, in a manner of speaking, that means that you can't colonize space. That's kind of the unspoken rule there. It says that, if we were to go to Mars, for instance, and plant our flag and say we own Mars, we can't do that because it would be illegal. Now, the only way to technically enforce that is to send somebody else up there to take that flag down, which is kind of the unspoken problem with this sort of law, which is part of how the Brookenden Accords came to be in 2059. They decided, well, we can't really stop people from staking claims in space, but what we can do is establish a legal and legislative framework for it. So it basically makes it possible for nations, corporate entities, maybe even partnerships between nations or corporate entities, whatever, to establish settlements on other planets, to mine, to do whatever. And then, obviously, over the course of the next few centuries, to also establish places to live as humans go there seeking new jobs, new opportunity, and escape from Earth and everything like that. With the first permanent settlement being established on Titan in 2086. That's the largest moon of Saturn, which is the 6th planet, I want to say. Yeah, 6th planet. The golden age of space is one of those periods where, it really lives up to the name. In 2097, the United Nations and ICA founded the Community of Gaia as a means of overseeing the recovery of Earth's biosphere. By 2097, there'd basically been like 300 years of reckless industrialization of the Earth. Climate change, pollution, over exploitation of resources, all these things have contributed to making the Earth not a nasty place, but not really a nice place. The Community of Gaia oversaw the re-greenification of the Earth. Yeah, so between 2097 and like the late 2200s, so like basically for about 200 years, they were the main body on Earth responsible for trying to get people off of fossil fuels, for getting people to depend on renewable energy sources, things like that. Basically turning the planet, and really pretty successful. Lots of hiccups. I'm sure there would surely be lots of hiccups over those couple of centuries. But by the time of the Spacers Saga, which is almost 3 centuries after the Community of Gaia was founded, the Earth is basically a solar punk utopia. I mean, there's still problems and there's still conflict here and there, but most countries are using renewable and clean energy sources. The population has actually decreased since its height in the mid 21st century because people just aren't having kids at the same rate they used to since most of the world is developed and just sort of sustaining its population. 2112, you've got the first of the 6th generation artificial life forms. The 6th generation artificial life forms were notable because they were the first generation that really had something like human, they could really blend with humans just to an extent. Now, at that point, they weren't quite human. They weren't, because they were basically still sort of biological robots. But the thing is, by 2112, the companies that produced them had figured out how to facsimile humanity well enough that you could at least fool the layperson. You know, a skilled investigator, again, in the vein of a Blade Runner, if we wanted to get reference happy here, could spot them because there's certain tells that they would have. But the average person would not really know the difference if you just sat one down in a room and had them maybe reading a book or something, which is kind of the goal of this product, is to have them blended with humans. And then in 2125, scientists funded by the ICA revealed the discovery of alien life forms in the oceans of Enceladus, which is a frozen moon of Saturn. It has a subsurface ocean of liquid water beneath its icy crust. And the ICA, after the ICA ends up setting up a biological preserve that basically sets aside the entire moon of Enceladus to preserve the life forms there so they can be studied and presented and cherished for posterity. Then in 2142, the Tian Shan Mining Corporation started off as one of the first asteroid mining cartels to actually make money. And from there, it just snowballed. And they made untold trillions of dollars cornering the market on asteroid mining, and they started basically absorbing smaller organizations, merging with mid-sized organizations. And by 2142, they were so large and powerful, they basically owned half of the asteroid belt, at least in theory, at least on paper. One of those deals where it's kind of like, you might say, well, I own all of the silver in this mine. Well, it's not technically been mined yet, but yeah, I still own it. The Tianshan Mining Corporation owns the rights to all of these asteroids, and maybe like a third or two-fifths of the asteroids in the asteroid belt, or some huge number, maybe even half. And they use that wealth to buy up a huge stock in the mining operations on Mercury, which are just kicking off at that point, which are anticipated to be very lucrative because Mercury has more material than all the asteroids put together. That's how small the asteroids are. Because even though there's a lot of them, there's so little that when you put them all together, it's less material than the moon. So there's less material than Mercury too, because Mercury, if I'm not mistaken, is bigger than the moon. So at the time, by 2142, Mercury, which again has more material than all the asteroids put together, is just starting to be charted for mining. Obviously Mercury is actually one of the hardest planets to reach. It's not that it takes the longest to reach, which obviously that would probably be Pluto, since it took us 9 years to reach Pluto, even going so fast that we couldn't slow down. The thing about Mercury is, to get there, you have to fly close to the sun. Flying close to the sun is inherently dangerous because spacecraft are not made to withstand that kind of heat and radiation. So when you try and fall in towards Mercury, it's very difficult to fall into it and then be captured into Mercurian orbit. So around the 2120s to 30s, Mercury is just starting to be scouted at this point for mining and mining operations, because the powers that be back on Earth realize that all of this mineral and metal wealth on Mercury, mostly metals really, is going to be invaluable to making all sorts of things for the future of space infrastructure, whether it be Dyson swarms to collect solar power and beam it to all the planets of the inner solar system, whether it be spaceships to go out and mine the outer solar system and settle the outer solar system, even things like huge, enormous generation ships and to send to other star systems. So they're planning the mining of Mercury, and basically what happens in 2142 in this timeline is that the Tian Shan Mining Corporation steps up and says, "Hey, we'll buy a controlling interest in this in return for giving back some of the resources we've gathered from the asteroid belt." They're basically getting in on the ground floor of the Mercurian mining operation, and saying and basically they made themselves the board of directors, for example, would be rich as kings, would be richer than Mansa Musa by the time that all this was said and done, for better or worse. It's obviously not exactly a good thing for the sake of the people living under them, but again, that's commercialism. That's commerce. In 2168, we have the Confederation of the Main Belt, and by the 2380s, which is like when the frontier wars are taking place, is one of the most populous places in the solar system. That you don't even have to have that big a population on many of them, because like Ceres, which is the largest asteroid in the main belt, it's actually considered a dwarf planet. It only ever has like maybe like 500,000 people living on it during this part of the story. But when you've got, say, 100,000 worlds that have 10 to 100,000 people living on them, let's do a quick math. You take 10,000 worlds with 10,000 people living on them, that's 100 million people. You take 10,000 worlds with an average of 100 million people, of 100,000 people living on them, that's 1 billion people. The Confederation of the Main Belt is not small, and they're definitely very wealthy because they have all these resources, and they're well placed to utilize them. The Confederation of the Main Belt is kind of like the bougie, well-to-do, like neoliberal coastal parts of the United States. Like everyone is pretty much well-fed. There's clean cities because they're gravity balloons. That's basically a fancy way of saying a Neil cylinder inside of an asteroid. So they're like completely artificial environment. The United Nations of Mars is kind of like the slightly warped, militaristic, a little bit scary parts of the United States. Their partnership basically runs the solar system. It's kind of like how you've got the military, and again, it's kind of an analogy. It's kind of an analogy or stand-in for the military-industrial complex, because the Confederation of the Main Belt has the resources and the mercantile wealth and the mercantile strength to like send resources wherever they need to be. Mars has the industrial might and the military production capability to use those resources. So it becomes kind of like a symbiotic relationship, because the CMB funnels resources to Mars more so than anywhere else, and Mars turns those resources into warships and guns and ammunition and missiles, and those basically get turned into the bulk of the Spacer Corps fleet that then goes out and keeps the peace in the rest of solar space, which is code for saying keeps the rest of solar space, playing ball by the ICA's rules. Because the ICA, writes legislation that benefits, guess who? The Confederation and the United Nations of Mars, because they're powerful and they funnel resources back to Earth and they keep the status quo. But then, in 2201, the United Nations of Mars is founded by it's basically the same sort of thing as the Confederation of the Main Belt and the Galilean Union. It's early settlements on Mars coming together and sort of breaking bread and saying, hey, we're going to form a partnership. Because the United Nations of Mars, it's not a United Nations in the same way that, say, the United Nations on Earth is, where the United Nations of Mars is much more like a federation. Because on Earth, the United Nations is not really a federation. It's like I said before, it's kind of like an umbrella for a bunch of different nations to come under and like talk business, so to speak. On Mars, the United Nations of Mars is basically a federation. There's smaller nations that are part of it and smaller states that are part of it, but they're part of this federal entity called the United Nations of Mars. And that entity grows in strength and power over the next, 200, 300, 400 years, whatever it is. And becomes eventually very powerful, in fact. All right, so in 2219, you have the first inkling of trouble with what's called Project Wayfarer. But it happened on the 150th anniversary of the founding of the ICA. And what it was basically saying, it was a group called the Interstellar Consortium, which is basically a bunch of big business interests and shipping magnates and everything saying, hey, we want to pool our resources and establish a human colony in Alpha Centauri by 2200 or by 2300 rather. Yeah, because this is the 2200s. I forgot we'd crossed over. And it's kind of like how you've got these billionaires nowadays who want to have these big ego prestige projects, like establishing colonies on Mars or establishing O'Neill cylinders to move industry off of the Earth, stuff like that. This is kind of that writ large, because by the time Project, for sort of jump ahead a little bit and spoil some of what's going to come, Project Wayfarer ends up spending like trillions of dollars worth of money on 4 ships that are supposed to, because the main reason it costs so much is because they have to produce the antimatter, because these 4 interstellar spacecraft are driven by antimatter. And for the sake of our listeners, antimatter is very expensive to produce, even if you have the technology. I think, 1/100th of a nanogram of antimatter costs as much as a kilogram of gold. It is $62.5 trillion a gram. Now, by the 2200s, that we've discovered ways to bring that down significantly. But even if it costs, only a couple $1 million a gram, you spend a couple $1 million on a gram of material, and you need to make literally like tons of this stuff, you're going to end up spending trillions of dollars. Plus, you've actually got to model how to use it, and you've got to model and design and build the ships that are going to use it. You've got to train the passengers and crew and build the cryo tube. You've got lots of stuff going on. So this huge ego project, going back to the timeline, by 2219, the Spacer Core intelligence apparatus starts receiving reports that there's popular anger being aimed at Project Wayfarer. People say, well, wait a second. We've got problems here on Earth. We've got problems here on the world. The Earth is settled, where people are actually living. Why in the hell are we spending? It's kind of the classic dilemma. Why the hell are we spending, tens of trillions of dollars on this mission to colonize some star that nobody's ever seen, that nobody even knows if we want to go there, when we've got problems right here at home, and that will come back to bite us later. That sort of popular anger will come back to bite us in the butt down the line. One of the fastest spacecraft humans ever designed was the New Horizons probe, which went and took imagery of Pluto back in 2015. That thing took 9 years to get from Earth to Pluto. And again, as I said a little while ago, it was booking, as Neil deGrasse Tyson put it. It was going so fast they couldn't slow down to orbit Pluto. It took 9 years to get there, and they took pictures and then zipped right on by. An antimatter powered spacecraft could zip by Pluto probably in a couple of hours or a couple of days, depending on whether or not you had the afterburner and so on. Yeah, so basically to go from dry dock at Europa to Pluto would take maybe a few weeks. That was the shakedown cruise. So, and that's where we'll end today, because that's basically the gist of how Project Wayfarer got off the ground. We'll see how it develops and how problems arise as a result in future episodes.